With the 2026 midterms just 9 months away, today I'll be showing you guys my updated US Senate map prediction. This midterm cycle is going to be among the strangest we've seen in recent years, as the most competitive states are not the usual Georgia or North Carolina, but instead Alaska and Maine. And in this video, I will tell you which party is on track to control the upper chamber of Congress for the second half of President Trump's term. And so jumping straight into it, we're going to begin by filling in the solid states races that will be won by 15 percentage points or more. And so we'll begin with the safe red states, where we have Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, South Dakota, Kansas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. For the Democrats, the safe blue states are Oregon, Colorado, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Jersey, and Delaware. And so with just the solid states filled in, Republicans start off with a 4-seat lead at 44, Democrats at just 40. Moving on now to the likely states, these races will be decided by margins of 5 to 15 points. They'll be a little bit more competitive, but there will still be a clear favorite in each of them. And so starting off with the likely red states, we have Texas, where the incumbent here is actually John Cornyn, who has been in the Senate since the early 2000s. However, he is currently on track to lose the Republican primary, as according to the market odds on Kalshi, Ken Paxton has a 66% chance of being the nominee. John Cornyn at just 26. And Ken Paxton is the incumbent attorney general of the state of Texas, a role he's been in over the past decade. Meanwhile, on the left, James Tallarico, a member of the Texas State House, is the frontrunner. He has overtaken Jasmine Crockett in many of the Democratic primary polls and should end up on the ballot this November. And according to polling between the two, Paxton leads by 4.3%. This is not exactly the best margin for Republicans, but it's enough for him to win. And even though he's just leading by 4.3 according to the data, Texas is a state that President Trump carried by nearly 15 in 2024. There's no doubt that even with Paxton on the ballot, he would win by at least 5. And so the Lone Star State will be likely red. Next up, in Iowa, Republican incumbent Joni Ernst is retiring, and so we do not have any polls between Ashley Hinson, the frontrunner for the Republican nomination, and any of the Democratic candidates, but there's no doubt that Hinson is going to win. She is a current member of Congress. She would probably actually perform better than Joni Ernst, as the incumbent is incredibly unpopular, but with Ashley Hinson on the ballot, Iowa will be an easy win. The GOP will win by at least 5 points. Moving down to the South, we have South Carolina. This is generally a solid Republican state. However, in this case, with Lindsey Graham as the incumbent, he's probably not going to win by more than 15 points. He is just so unpopular, even among Republicans. The only reason why he's going to win his primary is because he still has the support of President Trump. And of course, he's going to win the general election because South Carolina is generally a pretty safe red state. In 2020, Lindsey Graham won his re-election by just 10 points. And in 2026, he is probably going to win a 5th term, even if it's not by 15. And so Lindsey Graham in South Carolina will give Republicans their 47th seat. And the final likely red state will be Florida, where Ashley Moody is running for another 2 years. She was appointed earlier this year by Governor Ron DeSantis to fill the vacancy left by Marco Rubio. And so if she wins this election, she'll be able to serve until 2029, and then in 2028, she'll have to run again if she wants to serve a full 6 years. And so Democrats were on track to nominate Jennifer Jenkins, but she has dropped out. And when she was in the race, she was trailing Moody by 9.1%. We don't have any polling between Moody and any of the other Democratic candidates. This is all we have right now, but there's no doubt that Florida will be red. I mean, Marco Rubio won his last term in 2022 by a 16-point margin. Now, Ashley Moody is not nearly as popular as Rubio, and so she will win by a lesser margin, but that will be more than enough still to give the GOP their 48th seat. And so with all of the solid and likely states filled in for the Republicans, they are just 2 seats away from winning the Senate, as of course they do have the vice presidency, which will mean that they'll be able to break any 50-50 ties. So Democrats need 51, Republicans just 50. And so shifting our focus over to the Democrats, we have 3 likely blue states, the first of which is New Mexico. Ben Ray Lujan will be running for re-election. He is on track to win. it's just not going to be by 15 points. In 2020, he won his first term by just 6.1 in a pretty close race against Republican Mark Ronchetti. He's probably going to win by a little more this time, but definitely not more than 15. And so New Mexico will be the first likely Democratic state. The second will be Illinois, where Dick Durbin is finally retiring. He's been in the Senate for 3 decades now, but he will be replaced likely by Raja Krishnamurthy, a current member of Congress. He's the favorite in the Democratic primary, and as a non-incumbent, he's probably not going to win by 15 points. I mean, even in 2020, Dick Durbin, the incumbent, won by just over 15. So without the incumbency advantage, Democrats are going to win Illinois by a likely margin. And then the final likely blue state is going to be Virginia, where Mark Warner, the incumbent Democrat, is running for re-election. He was first elected in 2008, and there was a chance earlier this year that Glenn Youngkin was going to challenge him, but that seems to have fizzled out. Glenn Youngkin is not going to run for the U.S. Senate this year, and that is a big blow to Republicans, as he was probably the only GOP candidate that had a good chance of winning. And so Mark Warner now is probably going to win by around 10 points, very similar to his margin from 2020. And so Glenn Youngkin instead is probably gearing up for a presidential bid or trying to become the VP in 2028. If he loses the Senate race, his capital politically is going to drop significantly, and so that's probably a big reason why he decided not to run in the race. So Virginia will be likely blue without Glenn Youngkin, and so with the solid and likely states now filled in for both parties, Democrats trail at 43, Republicans again just 2 away from winning the Senate. And so we now have just 9 states remaining. These 9 races are going to decide who will control the Senate for the next 2 years. And so we're now going to move on to filling in the lean states. These races are categorized by margins of 1 to 5%. They are going to be among the most competitive in the country. They could realistically go either way. However, one party does still have a slight edge. And the first lean state on this map is Michigan. This is actually the first flip on the map so far in this video. The incumbent here is Democrat Gary Peters, who barely won his re-election in 2020, defeating John James by just 1.7% in a race that nobody thought was going to be close. And so now that he has decided not to run for a 3rd term, the seat is open. Democrats are on track to nominate Mallory McMorrow. At least she's the current favorite. According to the market odds on Kalshi, she has a 47% chance of being the nominee. There are still 2 other big candidates, so this is not a done deal, but McMorrow has been the favorite for many months now. And then on the right, it's going to be Mike Rogers. He already has the support of President Trump. He is going to be the nominee. And you may remember that Mike Rogers ran for the U.S. Senate in 2024, losing to Alyssa Slotkin by less than half a percentage point. He might have lost, but this race was incredibly close and so much closer than anyone really expected. Mike Rogers basically got no funding from national Republicans. If he did have more money, he likely would have been able to win. This is a state that President Trump barely won in 2024. Alyssa Slotkin did slightly outperform Kamala Harris, but Mike Rogers' performance was a lot better than anyone could have expected. And so in 2026, he is a very good candidate for Republicans to nominate. He leads in the polls by 1.2% and actually has led in the vast majority of the polls that have been conducted here. And so Michigan is going to be close. It could still stay with the Democrats, but for now, I have the Wolverine state as lean Republican. This is the first flip on the map, giving the GOP their 49th seat. The next lean state we have is Ohio, right next to Michigan. Ohio generally is not lean Republican. It's a solid or likely GOP state now. However, the only reason why this state is close is because Sherrod Brown is going to be the Democratic nominee. He is a former 3-term U.S. Senator who lost his seat in 2024, losing to Bernie Moreno by just under 4 points. And so he is now trying to get his old job back, running against John Husted, who, just like Ashley Moody, was appointed earlier this year, this time by Governor Mike DeWine, to fill the vacancy left, of course, by J.D. Vance. And so John Husted, if he wins, he's going to win 2 years, and then in 2028, he'll have to run for the full 6. And according to the polling conducted thus far, Republicans lead by 1.5%. This race is close, and the polling does suggest a pretty tight race. However, polls in Ohio almost always underestimate Republicans by a pretty significant margin, and considering the fact that these U.S. Senate races have national implications, it is hard to see Ohio actually vote for Sherrod Brown. They just voted him out in 2024, and according to the market odds on Kalshi, the GOP has a 61% chance of winning this race. It is going to be a lot closer than it would have been without Brown on the ballot, but John Husted will likely be able to do enough to hold on and remain in the upper chamber of Congress. So Ohio is going to be the second lean Republican state. And then the last lean red state on our map will be Nebraska, where we have a surprisingly close race considering that President Trump carried it by 21 points in 2024. And the reason for that is because we have an independent candidate running, that being Dan Osborne, who is challenging the Republican incumbent Pete Ricketts. And so in 2024, Dan Osborne ran against Deb Fischer and lost by just under 7 points, which is a pretty good performance for an outsider like Osborne. He is now trying to challenge Ricketts, who was appointed to the Senate to replace Ben Sasse in 2023, and then won a 2-year term in 2024, defeating his Democratic opponent by 25 points. But this time, now that he is not running against a Democrat, he is going to struggle a little bit more here. However, he is still probably going to win. He leads by 0.4% in the polls, but he is probably going to outperform expectations. If we look at the market odds on Kalshi, he still has a 69% chance of winning. Nebraska is highly unlikely to go to Dan Osborne, and so while the margin will be much closer than it usually is, it is still a state that Republicans are going to pick up, the final lean red state for the GOP. Switching sides now to the Democrats, we have 3 lean blue states, just as we had 3 lean states for the Republicans, and we're going to begin in New England, up in New Hampshire, a state that generally likes to elect Democratic senators. In 2020, Jeanne Shaheen was reelected by 16 points. She is now retiring, making the seat open. In 2022, Maggie Hassan won her reelection by 9 points. The last time New Hampshire elected a Republican senator was all the way back in 2010 with Kelly Ayotte, who lost the reelection in 2016 very narrowly and is actually now the incumbent governor. She is running for reelection in November. And so in the 2026 Senate race, with the seat open, Democrats are going to nominate Chris Pappas, a current member of the House of Representatives. Meanwhile, Republicans will go with John Sununu, who is a former U.S. senator that was elected in 2002 and was unseated in 2008 by Jeanne Shaheen. And according to the polling average, the Republicans trail by 4.1%. But this race is definitely winnable for the GOP. Maybe not right now, but in a few months, with more time for Sununu to campaign, this is a race that can get very, very competitive. New Hampshire generally would not be one of the toss-up states. However, with John Sununu on the ballot, this race is going to be a lot closer than it would have been if the GOP went with anyone else. And so New Hampshire is going to be lean blue, but this is definitely a race to watch. The Sununu family is incredibly popular and has a very long history of successfully winning elections in New Hampshire. But for now, it'll be lean Democrat. Coming back down to the south, we have what may be the second flip on the map, that being North Carolina, a state that Republicans currently control, with Thom Tillis as the Republican incumbent who barely won his re-election in 2020, and so he is now retiring, and instead the GOP will go with Michael Whatley, a former chair of the RNC. Meanwhile, Roy Cooper will be the Democratic nominee. He is, of course, the state's former 2-term governor who just left office last year. Roy Cooper has much higher name recognition in the Tar Heel state and is generally pretty popular, and that is why he is doing so well in the polls right now. He leads Whatley by 6.2%, but this race is likely going to get much closer in the months leading up to November. North Carolina is a very purple state, although it is a state that voted for Donald Trump in all 3 of his presidential runs, the only one of the 7 major swing states that went red in all 3 elections. And so for now, Democrats look like they're doing well, but this race is going to get closer. And so North Carolina will be lean blue, but this is definitely among the most competitive races in the country, and we'll see what happens. But for now, Democrats are the slight favorites. And then the final lean state on our map will be Minnesota, a state that's been in the news quite a bit lately because of the ICE operations in Minneapolis. And the state's incumbent Democratic Senator Tina Smith will be retiring this year, which means we have yet another open seat. Democrats will nominate Peggy Flanagan, the state's lieutenant governor. Meanwhile, Republicans will go with Michelle Tafoya, a former sports anchor and reporter. And so Minnesota is generally a blue state. It hasn't voted for any Republican in a presidential election since Richard Nixon won it in 1972. However, the GOP has come close in recent years. In 2016, Trump lost it by just 1.5% in a shockingly close race. And then in 2024, Kamala Harris defeated Trump by another lean margin of just 4.2. And this is with Tim Walz, the state's literal governor, on the ballot with her. And so Minnesota has been trending to the right in recent years. It is a potential pickup for Republicans. According to the only poll we've seen thus far between the two candidates here, Democrats lead by just 3 points. And so for now, Democrats do have a slight advantage, but this race is definitely one to watch. And so Minnesota will be the final lean state on our map, and it will go into the Democratic column. And so only 3 now remain: Alaska, Georgia, and Maine. Maine and Alaska being in this final group is pretty surprising. And so these 3 states will all go into the tilt category, which implies a margin of victory of less than 1%. These are basically pure toss-ups, but I do have a slight opinion on who I expect to win. All 3 of these states show up in the market for the closest Senate race this year in Kalshi: Georgia, Maine, and Alaska, Georgia, with the expectation that it will be the closest. Ohio is also on this list, although I do think Republicans will do better here than many people expect. We'll jump first into Maine, where I think everyone knows who the Republican candidate here is going to be. That, of course, is Susan Collins, who has been in the Senate since 1997. It is now running for a 6th term in office. The Democrats are probably going to nominate Janet Mills, the state's incumbent 2-term governor, and according to the polling thus far, Susan Collins leads by 0.1%. It really is just that close. Maine is going to be one of the most important states on the map this year, and Susan Collins is basically fighting for her life. In 2020, she was in a very similar situation where the polls had her losing by around 5 to 10 points to Democrat Sarah Gideon. In the end, she won by nearly 9 points. And this is on the same ballot where in the presidential election, Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump by 9%, which basically means that Susan Collins outperformed Donald Trump in 2020 by 18 points. That is just how well she performed in the last election. And arguably, Sarah Gideon was a better candidate than Janet Mills is in 2026. If elected, Janet Mills would be the oldest freshman senator in U.S. history. She is actually older than Susan Collins. And in 2020, if you remember, Democrats were leading by 5 to 10 points in the polls. The race was not expected to even be close. And so with Susan Collins now leading in the polls, albeit by 0.1%, I don't see enough to suggest the Democrats are actually going to flip this seat, at least right now. And so Maine will be placed into the tilt Republican category. I have Susan Collins just barely surviving. This will probably be her last bid for another Senate term. She's probably going to retire at the end of her next term in 2033. Next up, in Alaska, this race has gotten a lot closer in just the last few weeks. I've previously put it into the likely Republican category, but because we now have news that Mary Peltola will be jumping into the race, the election has gotten significantly closer. Peltola is a former member of Congress that was voted out in 2024 after just 1 full term. Meanwhile, Dan Sullivan, the Republican incumbent, has been in office since 2015. And according to the polling data, Democrats are ahead by just under 1%, but many of these polls were Democrat-sponsored. And even when Democrats lead, it's by a very small margin. This race is going to be incredibly competitive. Dan Sullivan is basically fighting for his life here. Peltola probably would have done a lot better if she ran for governor instead, but it seems that she does want to return to D.C. But according to the market odds so far, Republicans are still the favorites. Dan Sullivan has a 55% chance of winning. Alaska's race will be very interesting to watch, as we generally never see competitive races in the state. But for now, it's going to be in the tilt category, but I do have Sullivan with a very, very slight advantage. He is still the 2-term incumbent after all, so this will be the 53rd seat on the map for the GOP. And last but not least, we have Georgia. It's almost always a very, very close state, and 2026 will be no exception. Jon Ossoff is running for re-election after being elected in 2020 in a runoff against David Perdue. His election, along with the one that went to Democrat Raphael Warnock in Georgia, that was the special election that was held. both in runoffs. Those two races that went to Democrats were the ones that won Joe Biden the Senate majority for the first half of his term. And so now Ossoff is running for a second. Meanwhile, he's being challenged by Republican Mike Collins, who is a current member of Congress. And according to the polling data, Jon Ossoff leads by 1.8%. However, polling in Georgia almost always overestimates Democrats, and in the most recent poll, we have a tie between the two candidates, although it was Republican-sponsored. And so the Peach State will be incredibly, incredibly competitive, just as it typically is. I mean, in 2020, it was literally the closest state on the presidential map, with Joe Biden winning it by 0.2. 4 years later, though, Trump won it back, defeating Kamala Harris by 2.2%. And so Georgia is going to be the final state on our map. It's going to be tilt, but for now, with Jon Ossoff as the incumbent, with him having a slight lead in the polls, I am going to place it into the Democratic column. This will give Democrats their 47th seat. And so this is it. This is my updated 2026 U.S. Senate map prediction. I have Republicans on track to win 53 seats, Democrats winning 47. This midterm cycle is going to be very interesting to watch, but for now, the GOP goes into the Senate races with a clear advantage. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you like the video down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think will win. Do you think Republicans can actually hold on in Maine? And what do you think Mary Peltola can do in Alaska? And also make sure you're subscribed to the channel for more unbiased content just like this leading up to the midterms in November.